It's Mr. Flanagan here. It's good to speak to you again. Today I want to speak about Learning Unit 3, which is about the planning, the designing and presenting of a CAPS economics lesson, including the use of teaching aids and information technology. But before I go into the lesson, I first want to talk to you about the assessment 1. The marks weren't that good in assessment 1 because I think students, you do not go through the learning material. Remember, for multiple choice questions, it's important that you go through your learning material, you read through everything. You can't just answer, that is guessing. You need to go through every paragraph. For example, if you look here on the screen, you have 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. You need to go through that, read it with insight. Underline as you answer the questions. Remember, the next multiple choice assignment is assessment number 3. So you need to go through that in detail. Then next week, Wednesday, you are supposed to submit assignment or assessment number 2. And assessment number 2 consists of questions from Learning Unit 2. 70% is coming from Learning Unit 2. And the other 30% is coming from Learning Unit 3. For assignment 2, question 1 to 5 is coming from Learning Unit 2. And question 6 and 7 is coming from Learning Unit number 3. Now, Learning Unit 3 is what I want to look at today, and it consists of the introduction and assessment criteria. It says in this learning unit, the annual teaching plan in CAPS economics will be analyzed in planning, designing, and presenting economics lessons for grade 10 to 12. In the process, the lesson plan or the lesson plan template will be used in individual economic lessons plans. The CAPS for economics give a broad outlay of the topics to be covered. The ATP, that is the annual teaching plan, are a more detailed document of the topics to be covered for the year, per quarter, and per week. So today I specifically want to talk about the ATP and also about the lesson. The lesson is growing out of the ATP. The lesson is the most direct intervention by the teacher, and thus the most direct accompaniment of the learner's activities and objectives. This is very important where as a parent teaches or guides their children in a spontaneous way, teaching by the teacher is planned. Teachers should therefore familiarize themselves with the content of the ATP and work out how to transform it into a lesson plan. So you first of all have your CAPS document. From the CAPS document is a broad document. You have your ATP, which gives you more detail. In other words, how long you must take on a specific topic. And then you have the individual lesson, which is giving you the fineness of details of what you want the learners to know. The value of teaching aids to complement the lesson plan also become important. That is why that also forms an important part of the lesson. The lesson template to plan and design the lesson for a specific topic or period must be available to assist the teacher and also serve as a record that the lesson took place. Remember, you cannot only go to the class with the textbook and read from the textbook and expect the learners to understand. You need to have worked out the lesson beforehand. What are you going to do as an introduction, etc. Right. Then there is the learning outcomes. Develop pedagogical content to plan, design, and present appropriate lesson plans from the ATP, comprising the use of teaching or media aids, including information and communication technology related to teaching CAPS FET economics. And there's your assessment, different assessment criteria. Then 3.2 is the necessary planning by economics teachers to design a lesson. And you can see there's a picture of a teacher that's hard at work preparing for the next day. No teacher that is worth his salt can go and teach without preparing. It is important that you sit down and you prepare your lessons for the next day. Otherwise, you are going to fail or your learners are going to fail in the classroom. The second paragraph tells us here a lesson should be, above all, be dynamic. There should be movement at all time. And you can't determine that in the spur of the moment. It must be planned beforehand. The dynamic dimension lies in the teacher accompanying the learner from does not know, from ignorance and cannot inability to knowledge and ability, and in the learner's education towards adulthood. The aims and objectives of the lesson plan for the teacher are fundamentally as follows. What is the aim or objectives of today's lesson? What do I wish to achieve with the lesson? That is the objectives. How are we going to do it today? The method. What is the teacher's role in the lesson? How much subject matter are we going to deal with? That is very important. You can't overload the teachers, although you will shortly see that there is criticism against the ATP, that it is overloading learners. Which educational aids are you going to use? Are you going to use posters? These days, of course, we make use of technology, social media, in addition to our normal teaching. What activities am I going to include? In other words, you must work out beforehand how are you going to include the learners in your lesson. How could the teaching and learning effect be determined? That is through assessment. And how should I evaluate and assess the work done? Although we will talk more about that in the next module. It says that the lesson plan is the most important part of teaching. All aims and objectives should happen within the confines of the CAPS for economics in the South African classroom. In other words, you must always have your CAPS document nearby when you plan, when you set out your lesson plan. Then the teacher must realize in this paragraph here the enormity of the task left on his shoulders by parents, leaving their children with them to discover content, knowledge, skills, and values about the life world. Then it says further, the teacher should give careful attention to the connection between each lesson and the reality of the world through the objectives of a lesson. What is important for you to know is that the eventual lesson topic presented to the learners has its origins in the curriculum. And where do we find the curriculum? in the curriculum and assessment plan, CAPS. Economics is offered as a subject at secondary level grades 10 to 12 and then at tertiary institutions. It should be possible for learners to master the subject matter included in a school curriculum with varying degrees of ease or difficulty because learners differ from one another. Economics is one of the many subjects available to learners today. It follows that curriculum designers and teachers should always take into account the children, the nature of the subject, the demands of society, and the purpose of teaching the subject. Then the subject matter in the subject curriculum is divided into 3 separate syllabuses, grade 10, 11, and 12. And when you teach, you must be aware of who you are teaching. Maybe you have all 3 grades to teach, and you can easily get confused what you teach to the grade. If you just had a grade 12 class and you do the circular flow, you might teach it in the same way to the grade 10s that come in the period thereafter. You must be aware that you cannot teach the grade 10s the same content that you taught the grade 12s, for example. Then further goes on to say the economics teacher should consider 2 aspects in respect of subject matter when preparing a lesson plan. First of all, the subject matter must be reduced. Teachers should ask themselves, what do learners need to know in order to get to the root of this matter? Clearly, the reduction of subject matter is primarily a question of knowing one subject thoroughly. These essentials should then be communicated in a language the learners can understand. Then stating the problem, learners are usually fairly unconcerned with themes in the syllabus as identified by the teacher. Yes. Their main concern is that they have to master them for examination or assessment purposes. Teachers, you assume that their learners are interested in the projected themes as they are, and this will stimulate learners to study, will often be cruelly disillusioned. Teachers have to shape their theme into a problem that has to be solved and engage learners fully. However, teaching is not necessary to deal with a problem in every lesson. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 periods to solve a problem. Right. Then we come to where I want to be today, namely basic lesson design by the economics teacher and the annual teaching plan. Now, here the teacher needs to understand the following basics in respect of lesson design. Depending on the purpose, basic forms of learning happens according to discussion, according to play, assignments, or exemplification. Discussion, depending on its purpose, conversation in the teaching of economics may take the following forms, exposition, reasoning, explanation, debate, and discussion of a theme. Also, the drudgery can be taken out of learning by introducing play into a lesson. The child's involvement with the team will be intense since play brings about a cognitive encounter between the child and the subject matter. Assignments, the assignment follows the exposition of the subject matter in the first glimmerings of insight by the learner. Then exemplification. Exemplification is inherent in teaching. For instance, a parent will show a child an example of a poisonous berry and warn him or her not to eat it. In this way, the subject matter becomes real. A visit to a class assembly plant reveals the advantages of specialization in that particular plant, but the advantages apply in principle to all industries and all sectors of the economy. What form of learning is taking place here between those 4 forms? Right. But I want to get to the ATP. One of the prerequisites for successful teaching is advanced planning. The annual teaching plan is an instance of a long-term advanced planning. It is true that plans can be thrown into disarray, but the more thorough the planning has been, the better the teacher will be able to cope when this happens. The ATP arranges the content of the syllabus into logical sequence in which it has to be taught. And it says here the annual teaching plan should be a functional planning document designed for constant consultation and should include the following aspects: the specific objectives, the subject, literature, teaching aids, methods, assessment planning, and comments for future planning. This is very important. In South Africa, the ATP is prescriptive. In other words, you must do what the ATP is telling you. Luckily for you, you won't have to work out an ATP. The department is drawing up annual teaching plans and it sends it to the schools and it must be followed. Right? The ATP is prescriptive. Everybody must do in that particular province, or even in South Africa, must do what the ATP is saying. In week 1, you must do this. Everybody's got to do this. So that when a learner changes schools, it is not difficult for him to catch up when it comes to the next school, because all schools should more or less be at the same place in the syllabus. The drawing of these ATPs are guided by step 1. As I said, you may have to know this, but the ATPs are normally sent to the schools. And the ATP has been worked out by the department. The South African school year consists of about 200 days, that is 40 schools week. Then they worked out the net teaching time, makes space for administrative matters, revision tests and exams. This leaves 30 to 33 weeks teaching time respective. Teaching time. You must especially be careful as a teacher. If you teach the grade 12 subject, time is allocated. This is very important. Time is allocated in term 4 for activities which you need to have done in the middle of term 3. You be aware of this. If you get to a school and you have to teach grade 12, whatever subject, both the CAPS document and the ATP makes provision for teachings of grade 12 still to happen in term 4. But in reality, that does not happen. You must be done with terms 4's work or all the work for that subject in the second week of August. And they say allow more time for difficult work. According to the ATP, you cannot really do this because the ATP is content driven. It tells you exactly where you must be at a certain time. And here is an example of an economics annual teaching plan for grade 10. And the example is the latest such document from one of the provincial education department. There you have the topic, economics basic concepts. This must be taught in week 1, 12 to 21 January. And that is 6% of the entire syllabus. Then in week 2 and in week 3, which is stretching from the 24th of Jan till the 4th of February, you must do the basic economic problem. That's another 6%. And that 6% plus that 6% gives you a cumulative percentage of work to be done by the end of week 3. That should be 12%. Then week 4, week 5, and week 6, that is 3 weeks, you must do the circular flow and quantitative elements. That is 8.8% of the work. You can see there was 2 weeks, 6%. This is 3 weeks, takes up 8.8%, nearly 9%. So that 12% plus that 8.8% gives you 20.8%. Then week 7, week 8, and week 9, you must do business cycles. It's another 8.8%. So the cumulative coverage of the ATP at that stage should be that 20.8 plus 8.8. It gives you 20 something, 8. And then the last weeks is revision and control tests. Now, what must be done here under assessment? Informal assessment, data response questions, essay topics, etc. And then you also have a formal assessment, which is an assignment and test 1. And this is what you must do. So the ATP puts teachers under a lot of pressure. And therefore, there is a lot of conversation going about if the ATPs or the syllabus per se is not overloading to teachers and learners. Especially the slowest learners are battling to keep up. So the teacher wants to work with the slower learners, but on the other hand, he's constrained by the ATP that demands of him to be at a specific stage at a specific time. In an article in the Mail and Guardian titled Plan, that is the ATP, the annual teaching plan, outpaces the teachers and learners. The reasons why the Department of Basic Education introduced the ATP is given as because of low achievement of learners, especially with regard to reading for meaning. Now, if we open up that link there, it is important, especially for your assignment 2, question 6 on the ATP, that you go through that article. And it says, the writer is saying about bumping into a friend who says he's becoming tired of the jam-packed curriculum that leaves no time or space of him to be responsive to the children or to do anything creative. You will also experience that. During a recent interview, a primary school teacher from such a school said that the curriculum is so fast-paced and overloaded that she and her colleagues have to teach extra classes 3 afternoons a week for the children who didn't understand the work taught in the class. And it can also happen to you. Remember, the subject of ours is not a simple subject. It is a involved, sometimes complicated subject, especially when it comes to microeconomics. Unfortunately, teachers have to abide by the annual teaching plan, which is a schedule for each subject that outlines exactly what topics need to be taught on specific days throughout the school year. Departmental officials check to see that teachers are covering this work at the pace that the annual plan requires. And by this, the departmental officials doesn't necessarily mean people from the department. It already starts at school where your HOD is coming to sit in your classes and also check your where you are with the work. Also, the head of academics can come into your class. If teachers are not keeping up, they need to find ways to catch up, such as teaching extra classes. To understand why the department has implemented this curriculum schedule, we need to understand the problems the plan is hoping to solve. One thing we are very clear about is that learners' achievement is low. Less than half of all grade 3 children are able to read for meaning because the teachers have to go so quickly through the syllabus. So because these learners haven't learned to read earlier on in their careers, now you sit with that problem when they come to grade 10, 11, and 12 economics. A 2016 report by the Stellenbosch University of Research on Socioeconomic Policy argues that there are four major binding constraints that is making it hard to achieve quality education. These are poor organization, inappropriate interference by teachers' unions, teachers' poor content knowledge, and weak pedagogical knowledge. What is pedagogical knowledge? The ability to teach the content clearly and coherently, and the poor use of time. Thus, it makes sense that an annual teaching plan will ensure better curriculum coverage and use of the teaching time. So the thinking is that if there is a prescriptive curriculum, then teachers will have to abide by that as an employee of the department. Novice teachers, you will be a novice teacher when you go out next year, seem to find the plan particularly helpful because it clearly shows them what they need to teach and when. Before I forget, I just want to tell you that sometimes the textbook is not in the same order as the teaching plan, so you need to be aware of that, right? Compare the textbook that you use to the annual teaching plan and see what pages from the textbook you can use according to the teaching plan. So they said that novice teachers find the plan helpful because it shows them where they need to teach. But like any one size fits all intervention whose primary purpose is monitoring and accountability, the annual teaching plan has unintended consequences. Many experienced teachers feel that it undermines their professional judgment because it allows no room for responsiveness or creativity. For some teachers, it may lead to a compliant box-ticking approach to teaching because they need to prove that they are covering all the required topics in the required time frame, even though they know that many learners have not adequately grasped the concept. Yes, unfortunately, that is the case. You try as much as you can to see that learners understand, but unfortunately, you are also being driven by time constraints. And a lot of teachers are losing their love for teaching because of that. The cruel reality is that learning outcomes are weakest in the schools attended by the poorest children. For teachers in these schools, the annual teaching plan is simply too fast for many of their learners, whose actual learning is likely to be 3 years below the grade that they are in. So that is a very, it's not good to hear that, but it is reality that some learners are struggling to keep up the pace. The annual plan assumes that the only challenge for learners is the curriculum is not being adequately covered by their teachers. It does not acknowledge the huge gap in learners' knowledge and skills that cannot be easily plugged. These gaps will only be remedied if teachers can carefully diagnose learners' understandings, misconceptions, and knowledge gaps. What is needed is progressive building of the foundational understandings and skills that are missing. An over-ambitious curriculum taught at a fast pace can cause more learners to get left behind early and stay behind because there is no time for this diagnosis and reconstruction work. Yes, unfortunately, if learners do not understand the work, you'll have to make some time I've worked a lot on Saturday mornings, especially with my grade 12 learners, especially on the microeconomics part of the work. Because unfortunately, the time that you have in class is unfortunately not enough, especially for the slower learners. Improve curriculum coverage, which is intended by the ATP, and better use of learning time in classrooms is necessary, but will not be sufficient for all learners to acquire the knowledge and skills they need. If the amount of content was reduced and the pace of the curriculum coverage slowed down, it is more likely that learners could develop even deeper conceptual understandings, particularly in learning to read with comprehension and in developing a strong number sense. All right? But unfortunately, currently as the ATP stands, there is no time for this. Curriculum pacing needs to be more flexible so that teachers can be responsive to the learning needs of the learners in the classroom and not simply cover the required topics. This is, of course, a normative statement. This is what we want to see. Unfortunately, it is not the case currently. Despite the misgivings of this article, the DBE continued to issue ATPs to school via its provincial counterparts. The written lesson plan evolves out of the ATP. Each lesson should moreover be self-contained unit with its own goals and objective, and the teacher has to assess whether he or she has achieved the various objectives. Right. Now we are going to look at the lesson plan. Paragraph 3.4. Identify didactic principles. That is how you teach. The types of lessons that you can teach. And the writing of the final economics lesson using the UNISA template. This is important. So here are the didactical principles which you've also dealt with in learning unit 2. And there is also a question in your assessment 2 on these didactical principles. And you need to go through it. Traditional principles, the principles of totality, the principle of individualization, principle of activity, principle of motivation, principle of perception. Unfortunately, I do not have time to go through it. You need to go through it yourself. Then the 3 lesson types. And as I said before, these principles are important also for assessment number 3 for when you have to do multiple choice questions. The lesson types that you need to be aware of is the informative lesson. This lesson is suited to anything because it involves a transfer of knowledge from the teacher who possesses the facts and skills to the learners who have not yet acquired these. And then they say ideally learners should be actively involved. They should not be allowed to simply sit and listen. Then the drill lesson, you normally do this. If you are certain that, for example, an essay question is going to be asked in a test or an exam, drill it with the learners because they do not do it themselves, or very few of them are doing it. The aim of drilling is to inculcate and consolidate associations by means of repetition. Drilling should not be based only on the law of practicing, but also in the law of understanding. Certain sections of the work require more drilling than others. Here, learners' interest should be retained as long as possible. Keep drill periods short and vary them sufficiently. An example of the drilling lessons could be cyclical patterns and compositions of business cycles in grade 10, as this is normally an essay question. It serves as a basis for grade 11s and 12. To keep your lesson interesting, motivation and a sense of humor are indispensable. Check for signs of fatigue or boredom. This is now perhaps the ideal that you check for those signs of fatigue and boredom. But I found that even if you see those signs and you have to cover content, you just have to move on, especially without ATP, the ATP environment in which we work. Another lesson is revision lessons. We've seen there in that ATP that I went through with you, the last 2 weeks is open for revision and examinations. But you must try and do revision of the previous day's lesson the next day, every day, even if it is just 2 to 3 minutes. Try to revise with the learners what you've done. Right. But then you get a lesson in itself that is a revision lesson. The most important didactical principles in this case are probably those of motivation, individualization, and totality. When work is being revised, the conditions are actually very favorable for the acquisition of deeper insight, greater skills, and certain practical techniques. Right. No lesson type is pure. You can use different types at different times of the lesson. Reflection on and knowledge of lesson types undoubtedly contribute to lesson planning. Teachers should account for a lesson from a pedagogical form and a subject dialectical perspective. To write out a lesson is to give concrete expression to the teacher's reflection on didactic situations. Please, students, when you go out to teach, even when you go do practice teaching, prepare properly by writing out your lesson. There is no fixed recipe for a successful lesson. A teacher's individuality is visible in his or her style of teaching. The actual presentation of the lesson may be compared to the tip of the iceberg, most of which lies below the surface. All right. So what comes out in class is what you've done the previous day through your planning. The following points should be considered in any lesson plan: the routine or localizing information, the goals and objectives, what teaching aids that you use, brief resume of what the class already knows, summary of the proposed introduction, plans for the main lesson activity, and explanation of how the lesson is to be concluded. The chief objective of writing out a lesson is to force students to review their teaching practice critically. After all, teachers' sole claim to the status of professional practitioners is the degree in which they can account for their practice. An example of a completed lesson plan is provided as a guide when planning your specific lessons. Now, this is the lesson plan template that I've referred to. Right here, you have what we call localizing details. Under here, you put the subject that you will be teaching, which is economics. The course is for grade 10s and how much time is there per lesson plan and the number of learners in a class. Then what is the theme of the lesson? The theme in the syllabus or the theme in the CAPS curriculum, depending on what you are teaching. Unemployment is a theme. Poverty is a theme. Right? You have the theme in the syllabus, which is overall economic pursuits, and then the lesson theme. Then you have the reduction of the lesson. Are you teaching macro? You do a macro analysis, an overall analysis. Micro analysis is the relevant concepts to be taught, the interrelationships. For example, if you are going to teach the circular flow, You are going to deal with households, so you first define that. Businesses, the government, the foreign sector, what is the interrelationship amongst them, etc. Then, what is your objectives that you hope to achieve? And then the objectives that you hope the learners will achieve. Then we come to the lesson pattern. This is very important. Actualization of existing knowledge, stating the problem, exposition of new subject matter, assessing absorption of new subject matter, and functionalization. Now, this is one of the questions in assessment 2, the actualization of existing knowledge. What is this about? The purpose here is to make learners aware of how incomplete their knowledge is. They should be able to experience and also to express the problem that is taking shape. For example, in the circular flow lesson, the circular flow we have done introductively in grade 8 and 9. You need to assess how much knowledge do the learners have. And they still record what they've done in grade 8 and 9. Right? And that is how you establish how much knowledge they have. And then you talk about the interrelationships, the household sold their labor to the businesses for which the business in turn pay them again. All this are happening through the markets, etc. So that is what you need to know. Then stating the problem, the purpose is here to make learners aware of how incomplete their knowledge is. They should be able to experience and also to express the problem that is taking shape. Then the exposition of new subject matter. How would you assess learners' understanding of the new concepts? And so forth. Then assessing absorption of new subject matter. This can be done during or after the exposition. That is through constant questioning. Then functionalization, what is that? It's not a matter of mere drilling, coaching, or memorizing. It is based on the mastery of new information. It implies that the learners make it their own, acquire deep comprehension, and it is a quest for better achievement. And then lastly, what you need to have in your lesson plan is your assessment. The teacher assesses his or her success in transmitting the material. It is also an exercise in orientation for the learners. But as it is being said there in brackets, you will deal with assessment more in learning unit 4. So in terms of the lesson plan for your assessment, remember that you need to make sure that you understand this section here, actualization of existing knowledge. I think in the assessment, they give you a topic against which you need to explain this. Then what remains is the using of teaching aids and social media, which I will do in the following lesson. Then summary, I also have the references and I have the forums. I've completed my contribution to the forums for this particular learning unit. Unfortunately, I did not have any feedback from you. People, I encourage you to to contribute to this. This, remember, your learning experience is not only about tests and exams, but it is about getting as much information as you can while you are doing this course, which you will then use when you go out and teach. Right. Students, that concludes my lesson for today. I expect you to work well on your assessment 2, which covers, as I said, learning unit 2 and learning unit 3. 70% of the work comes from learning unit 2 and 30% from learning unit 3. Learning unit 3, you need to look at the ATP, because there is a question on your assessment on that and on the lesson plan, the actualization of existing knowledge. I conclude with that, and I wish you well. Thank you. Thank you, Tabang.
Thank you, Mr. Flanagan.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a long one. I think I'm gonna cut it into 2, ne?
Yeah, cut it into 2. The ATP and the lesson plan, you can split perhaps.
Okay. No, it's not a problem. Thank you, Mr. Flanagan.
All right, Tabang. Thank you, man.
Thanks. I'll communicate when I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.